If you clicked on this video, you're likely familiar, at least to some extent, with Fritz Lang's 1931 masterpiece, M. Upon watching M, beyond the subtext and themes, one thing sticks out above all else: the use and subsequent importance of sound. Before looking at how Lang achieved a mastery of sound in 1931, we have to understand the history of such in cinema just a few years prior. In 1888, Edward Muybridge, a man you might of course recognise for the images currently on screen, had an alleged private meeting with Thomas Edison where they discussed sound being utilised in tandem with moving pictures. Muybridge's Zoopraxiscope, the image casting tool for the video you see on the screen right now, was to be mixed with Edison's well-renowned sound recording technology. Now, despite no verbal agreement being reached, it's widely believed that the concept of sound in cinema began here. In 1923, some years later, a few short films began to implement sound in their pictures. The video you are seeing right now is one of those shorts.
Remember the last time you gave me a check for $15 on the First National Bank, yeah?
Prior to that, sound had never been utilised due to the sheer difficulty of synchronising and matching dialogue to an actor. Sound would be recorded and played back on separate devices, making it a somewhat arduous task to edit and sync up. Furthermore, many filmmakers and studios struggled to get the playback volume to be loud enough for the big screen. From there on out though, the merging of audio and moving of images would soon become a healthy relationship. By 1927, the first feature-length sound film, The Jazz Singer, was released. While filmmakers were still trying to get to grips with this phenomenon, the outcome was typically positive.
Wonderful pals are always hard to find. Some folks have one, some folks have none, and I was alone for years.
And this brings us up to 1931, in particular Fritz Lang's M. While many feature films were utilising sound for the sake of musical numbers or comedy, Lang opted for something entirely different. He mixed sound effects, whistling, and to the shock of many, overlapping dialogue as a means of achieving smoother cuts and better pacing. M was Lang's first sound feature film, although you'd never guess it from the way he controlled it in 1931. The film opens with a blast of sound as children sing a nursery rhyme about a man with a cleaver who turns you into mincemeat. Immediately, Lang is subverting the typically happy-go-lucky, sound-heavy feature films of the time, instead injecting a dark and macabre tone into the film. It was a way of captivating the audience, reminding them that they won't have a fun time at the movies that night. The Master of Darkness, as the British Film Institute would eventually dub him, saw M open to criticism and boycotts, since the majority of the German population believed him to be glorifying murder and, more significantly, child kidnappers. But if one listens closely to the sound in this film and truly analyses it, then we get a different reading of Lang's intentions. He deals with obsession, mental health, the similarities between law and criminals, and more. Sound is integral to the narrative and themes. Many times throughout M we hear doors banging and cars honking before they enter the screen. This stylistic decision meant Lang utilising limitations to his advantage, avoiding possible syncing issues as well as also giving the world he created some truthfulness to it. The whistling of the child murderer, Hans Becker, is the one thing that sticks out more than anything else. As he screeches the tune of Edvard Grieg's In the Hall of the Mountain King, he becomes all the more sinister to the audience. The whistling of Becker is utilised as somewhat of a precursor before we ever see his face. We hear his voice, hear of his highness' crimes, yet all we ever see is a shadow of him. A shadow when he kidnaps Elsie, his back when he buys her balloons. The whistling works as a cognitive way of keeping the audience in suspense and guess who is the actual killer. Once his whistle is matched to his face, much like how sound back then was matched to the images, we as the audience put two and two together. The whistling is powerful because it's the connective tissue between audience investment and engagement. When Becker is tempted, he attempts to calm himself at a nearby cafe. The expressive and naturalistic use of sound reflects his chaotic emotional state. We initially hear some cars driving by and honking, as well as the chatter of civilians, but as Becker fixates on the little girl, the street noises disappear as we instead fixate on his delirium. When the sound dies down, we are immediately transmitted into the killer's mind. Lang ultimately mixed the emergence of sound with the classic silence of cinema to create a moment of sheer transfixion. Becker snaps out of his trance as the sound effects of cars reach a crescendo once more, his whistling mixed with the street noise. At the cafe, the street noise again disappears while Hans struggles to suppress his urges and find solace by manically whistling. In doing this, Lang is almost humanizing the murderer, showing that he has mental health issues and isn't simply someone who enjoys what he does. This is supported, of course, by the heart-stopping finale and monologue.
Kann ich denn anders? Hab ich denn nicht dieses Verfluchte in mir? Das Feuer, die Stimme, die Qual. Du willst also damit sagen, dass du morden musst? Immer muss ich durch Straßen gehen.
The sound elements function less as a depiction of environment, but rather a portrait of Becker's manic and conflicted mind. Following Elsie's abduction, Lang connects a sequence of shots that beautifully intercut the murderer's actions with the girl's mother. Sound is the connective tissue within all these shots. Elsie's mother shouts her name, and with each horrifying yell, we see an empty area where Elsie would otherwise have been found under normal circumstances.
Elsie! 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 Elsie!
Finally, the sequence finishes with shots of a ball rolling alone, the ball Elsie happily played with at the start of the film. Elsie's mother's shouts grow faint, disconnected, and distant. We know what has happened without seeing a thing. Lang allows our imagination to run riot while sound design carries the entire scene. In this sequence, the continuity is derived from the soundtrack. The mother's cries unify all the scattered shots, and the distance inferred by the tone of call suggests that Elsie becomes more and more lost with each cut. It's crucial to note as well that when Becker is eventually found, it's by a blind man who has memorized his sinister whistling. Even within the film and its characters, sound is hugely important. Despite being a talkie, M doesn't rely on that gimmick. The audio almost always feels important, every word of dialogue having some form of subtextual power. There are long stretches of silence, such as when the police raid the building full of criminals. We hear nothing, not a pin drop, until a bursting police siren. This works to make the world feel unpredictable and chaotic, forcing the audience to bask in the silence before being disrupted. By the end of the film, we see that the ugliest thing is not this murder, but the bystander nature of society and how judgmental we can be before acting. This is introduced wonderfully in the famous scene that intercuts between the police meeting and the criminals meeting. The leaders of both organizations discuss their frustrations about the child murderer and devise strategies for capturing him. What this does is it puts criminals and police on the same playing field, criticizing their approach and individualism in searching for a heinous person, rather than simply joining forces to save their community. The intercuts are so seamless, the dialogue so similar, that it feels as though Lang is saying they're both as bad as one another. and rather than simply relying on visuals to parallel action, Lang cuts on dialogue at one point, starting a sentence in the police camp and ending it in the criminal meeting.
Weiber müssen sich mehr an die Bullen heranmachen. Wie oft ist einer von uns verschütt gegangen, bloß weil das Mehl, bei dem geschlafen hat, an die Polente verpfiffen hat. Jetzt sollen Sie mal die Polente an uns verpfeifen. Jeder Wohnungsinhaber, jeder Hausbesitzer.
The cross-cutting is driven by dialogue. There are of course common visual elements, the meeting setting, the smoking room, the seating, the voice of the leader in each group. Despite these visual cues, it's the dialogue that's used to set up parallel action and give the audience a sense of progress. The pace and character of the dialogue establish and carry us through the scene. Sound, in particularly the way it was edited, actively affected the pace and cohesiveness of M, and on the other hand, it also added to the social criticism of Germany and society at the time. That too is without mentioning, of course, how it parallels the insane and ill mind of the killer, Hans Becker. Lang used sound as if it were another visual element, editing it freely. Notably is how Lang used the design of sound to overcome space and time issues. Since M, the world of film has benefited from the profound, lasting influence of Lang's creativity, ingenuity and structural approach in his first sound picture. Next time you watch film noir classics such as The Maltese Falcon or Sunset Boulevard and marvel at their symbolic sound design, remember where it all started, inside the genius mind of Fritz Lang.
I wonder what the time went. I wonder why my mind's bent. I wonder why my retina's connected to the nebula, but only get the message from the fine print.